Large property owners in Boston face new pressure to make their buildings more energy efficient. Mayor Menino wants to have the buildings use less energy and water as part of his plan to reduce greenhouse emissions. And the incentive for more efficiency would be a rating system, but some owners say the gains will be offset by the cost of meeting requirements for information. Carrying that message is our guest from the Greater Boston Real Estate Board. We'd like to welcome the Chief Executive Officer, Greg Vasil. Thank you very much for being with us, Greg.
Thank you for the opportunity to be on the show.
Greg, this is a plan that is similar to things being done in some other major cities, but what makes you worried about it here in Boston?
Our biggest concern is, number one, we embrace sustainability and environmental protection, absolutely. And our membership has done things in the buildings that they manage, both commercial and residential, and this measure would attach to both. And one of our concerns is there's a number of costs that we've done voluntarily, that we've incurred voluntarily, but these costs are being mandated and they will be passed through to the tenants. So it's not just large property owners, it's going to affect small property owners and in disproportionate ways, especially in the neighborhoods.
Now, when you say small, how small exactly are we talking about?
Condominium owners will be affected by this.
You mean if you just own one unit, or are we talking maybe buildings with a number of units?
Condominium associations with multiple units will be, so individual owners can be affected.
What about what goes into meeting the requirements here? Because they want data, so what would a building owner have to do?
Number one, the building owner would have to obtain energy usage data from the tenants in the building. So for example, if you were a smaller property owner in Downtown Crossing or say out in Dudley Square, you'd have to go to every tenant and get their usage data and plug that into Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Now for large property owners, many towers already do this type of activity, but the smaller folks don't. And that's one of our greatest concerns is it's going to be a sea change for them and they may not be able to get the data from their tenants. So the city is offering a stick to be able to force these tenants to give up the data, and they're going to go forward in the form of fines. We're concerned about that because it can hold an owner up if it can't get the data.
Is this a really cumbersome process of providing data? Because if it were as simple as checking a box on your electric bill for NSTAR to report something, that might not be so bad, but what about what this law would actually bring into effect?
It would be another level of bureaucracy, and we believe it would not be as easy as everyone says it is. Now, you alluded to earlier that other places around the country are doing this. We've enlisted the help of Dr. Robert Stavins from the Kennedy School of Government. He's an environmental economist. He studied these other jurisdictions where these ordinances are in effect and basically found that there's no value in them. And that's our concern. If we're going to do something like this, we want to make sure it works. We don't want to make people incur costs, and individual tenants will incur these costs if there's no value at the end and it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do.
Now, of course, the supporters will say there will be some savings here because if the buildings use less energy and less water, doesn't that add up too?
In theory, but how do you know that they will actually use less energy? For example, if I'm a commercial owner and I have a data center in my property, it's a very large user of power and of energy. I'm not going to score well because of the nature of the tenant that I have. If I'm an apartment owner and I have 25, 27 units of apartments and I have Mrs. McGillicuddy who's 85 and she runs her heat at 90 degrees, by right, I'm not going to score very high, but it's a result of the tenant's behavior in there, which the landlord really has no control over.
Well, if you're talking about whether it's a large apartment building or an office building, this law does call for subdividing control over temperature settings. So wouldn't there be an incentive for the tenants, whether they're residential or commercial, to keep down their bills?
Theoretically, we have some very old buildings and some very old housing stock in the city, most of which are not sub-metered. If everything was sub-metered, it would be a whole lot easier, but in Boston, that's not the case. Even in larger commercial buildings, some are sub-metered and some are not. It's difficult with older housing stock and older commercial stock as well.
What do you think this would do to the market? Because the market is at the moment pretty strong for rentals here, whether it's commercial rentals, residential rentals.
Our fear is it'll drive rental costs even higher. And that's a concern. Boston's rental costs have escalated in the past few years. That's why you see the number of rental projects currently under construction. And that's one of our biggest concerns in the neighborhoods. I'm not sure how much more people can pay in the form of rent, and these costs would be passed through. And on the flip side is we're not sure how it's supposed to work with affordable units, because this would apply to subsidized units. Those costs really can't be passed through, so we're concerned that it would affect the quality of life in those buildings, and actually those buildings would lower their standards in order to make do for these increased costs.
We're talking about other cities. Is there anything you know yet, or even have heard anecdotally about how this does affect the market in terms of how much it costs?
And that's one of the things that Dr. Stevens at Harvard has looked at, and he's really found no conclusive proof that there's been any value there. Now, the one thing that is helpful, and it happened in both San Francisco and to some extent in Austin, Texas, is that the utilities are at the table working hand in hand as a partner with the industry. I think that we need to get them more involved and engaged here. We've seen our utilities fall down a number of times, especially with some of the storms we've had and the service they provide to ratepayers. We all pay a tremendous amount of money in systems benefit charge for environmental conservation programs. One of the concerns we have with this program is we all, you, I, and my membership pays in the form of their bills. We're getting hit again if we have to follow the rules of this program. These costs something we've already paid for in the past.
Anything else you think should be done differently to at least move in at least that general direction of reducing emissions?
I think that a lot more could be done if we looked at providing incentives to the ownership community, both on the commercial and residential side. Potentially, there may be credits. There's a huge pot of money in the systems benefits charge that the utilities have. I wish that could be made available to ratepayers, both business and residential ratepayers, more than it currently has. Some of that money goes back to residential payers, but not enough goes back to commercial payers.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Greg Vasil from the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, and we'll have more news in just a moment.